So I'm going to be talking a little bit about some reflections on social ecological systems thinking and methods and how they're being used in practice and in policy, and some of the advances as I see it from work here in South Africa. Over the last 2 days, we've heard a lot about the innovations and advances being made in social ecological systems thinking and methods. And it's been really exciting to hear all these new ideas and new insights. And at the same time, we've heard a lot about the sort of complex challenges of sustainable development, which also face us, points made by Gary and Deborah around challenges of fairness and prosperity and sustainability in the Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene is a concept that Eduardo and Gary introduced us to yesterday, the idea of the real global scale human enterprise and the responses of the Earth system and how that shaped the Earth system. And we're all beginning to realize this actually presents a fundamentally different place and challenge for development now. It requires an enormous paradigm shift in development and sustainable development from how we've previously done that in the past. And this really has to do with, I think, 3 major challenges that the Anthropocene introduces into the development sphere. The first is that it's not only enough that development must be not bad or decoupled from the biosphere, it actually has to be good for the biosphere. It has to restore and make the biosphere more resilient to the Anthropocene and the challenges that it brings. It also means that development is no longer a local and place-based activity. It really has to become much more mindful about these global and regional telecouplings and teleconnections we've heard about in the last few days, and also vice versa, how local context matters to global changes. And I think we've heard a lot about the need to live with uncertainty and change, but development in the Anthropocene is actually going to have to thrive with uncertainty and change if we're to address, the growing needs of a growing human population. And so this seems to suggest that the work that we do in social ecological systems, complex systems, and resilience should have a lot of potential value to this new development in the Anthropocene space. And actually, I think it does, and we're already seeing some of that being demonstrated in some shifts in the development space. And this is really what I want to talk about in the keynote, just reflect a little bit on the traction and use of social ecological systems research in the planning and policy space, and also think a little bit about future directions that we might want to start turning our attention to. So the way I set up this talk was to think a little bit about the last 10 to 15 years of projects and programs in South Africa. Going back as far as the Southern African Millennium Assessment, which Steve kindly reminded us is now 15 years old. It made me feel a little old to realize that, and we have a bit of a SAFMA and MA reunion happening here actually, so it's quite nice to start thinking about where we've come over these past 15 years. So this set of projects and programs, these aren't all of them, these are just the ones that I have cool report covers of. They sort of span so many sectors and so many objectives, so many groups, and so many different approaches. But at their heart, they were really all about sustainability and sustainable development, and they were very focused on interactions with policy and practice and making changes and informing that space. What's interesting is when I started to think over these 15 years of projects and programs, one realizes how much has actually changed in that time. And these are just 2 axes that I could think of. The one is how these projects really started out deeply embedded in the conservation sector, and then started to engage with more and more sectors, and then actually started to bring the sectors together. So we had cross-sectoral interactions and collaborations in several of these projects. And now they're at a stage that I would almost deem sort of supra-sector. They're starting to engage with national planning commissions and development planning processes, which are actually supra-ministerial and do more than just span the sectors. At the same time, we've seen a real shift in the way we have worked with stakeholders. In the beginning, we would invite them to a workshop or tell them about what we were doing. We would inform them in some of these projects through really wonderfully packaged reports and communication products and presentations. And then we moved on to a more deeper engagement and participation. And now we're actually seeing this phase of co-design and co-production where the line between stakeholder and scientist is becoming increasingly blurred in several of these projects. Another shift that's obviously of relevance to this conference is a real shift that's gone from a very narrow focus at the species level, which has obviously always been important. South Africa is an incredibly species-rich and species-diverse area, but an expanding focus then on species and ecosystems, to a growing recognition of the links between people and ecosystems, with a real uptake of the concept of ecosystem services, beginning during the Southern African Millennium Assessment, but really taking traction in the last 10 years or so. But this sort of lens still saw people and nature and people and ecosystems as separate entities, and they were studied separately and managed separately. And this has really changed, I'd say, in the last 4 to 5 years, where we're seeing a much more intertwined and inseparable notion of social and ecological systems, where they're studied in tandem, studied together, and actually managed together. And this also brings in some new ideas about scale, as well as ideas about moving away from a static systems lens to a more dynamic lens when it comes to managing these systems. So this is all really great in theory, and it's a very exciting space to be a researcher and an academic. There's a lot of intellectual stimulation in social ecological systems thinking and methods. But how do we make it practical? For Deborah Roberts, there pictured on the bottom right, and her team, it took me a while to find a Google image of a woman with a tool belt who was fully clothed. It's a pleasure, Deborah. So really, how do we kind of develop this toolbox or tool belt for the people that Deborah was talking about in local government, who are excited and also stimulated by these ideas, but really frustrated with how you make them practical and useful. And there are, I think, many dimensions and many elements of how we are doing this. And I'm just going to focus on these 3 because they're the ones I sort of understand. But it'd be interesting to talk with some of you afterwards about other avenues that you might be working in. So the first is really this idea of a more social ecological approach to data measures and indicators, and this is becoming increasingly relevant with the Sustainable Development Goals and the massive flurry around indicators that we're soon going to be seeing. There's also been a real shift in some of the tools and methods being used in many of these projects and programs. And finally, in the larger process that actually is implemented across these projects. So when you start talking to decision makers about complex and social ecological systems, everyone gets a little depressed and paralyzed, because there is this perception that in order to understand anything, I need to measure everything. And I don't think this is actually a correct perception when it comes to complex systems. In fact, our understanding of complex systems like the climate, like the biosphere, and like the oceans have really allowed us to begin to distill out what are the essential dimensions relevant to change that is of relevance to development and to sustainability. And so we've seen a proliferation of these attempts to distill essential variables, from biodiversity variables, climate variables. We've now got a set of ocean and other variables. And we've even seen this kind of thinking being taken up more at an Earth system scale with frameworks like the planetary boundaries, and in a more interdisciplinary space around some of these ideas of the social variables that are the kind of variables we should be capturing, multidimensional measures of poverty, as well as Kate Raworth's just and safe operating space. And these essential variables and the ideas behind them are really fundamentally shifting the way we think about measuring and capturing data and these variables. And so, we have on the left there the real traditional approach, where you have a couple of goals, a proliferation of policy targets, a sort of infinite number of indicators, and monitoring systems that just intimidate any government agency responsible with implementation. And actually, I think this idea of essential variables, as well as our understanding of sort of social ecological interactions and trade-offs, is shifting these ideas into a more efficient and refined set of a narrow set of observations informed by our understanding of the essential dimensions of complex social ecological systems, which can then support a growing number of indicators, but in turn perhaps help us refine and think more about a refined set of targets and goals. And so avoid the kind of conversations we're hearing in the SDG space of 17 goals, 169 targets, 500 indicators, and 1 million monitoring stations, and really start thinking a little bit more cleverly around what data sets we need to collect. And while this is sort of very much taken from the Earth system space, I think this has relevance for a more social ecological space, where we're starting to see some very exciting data sets that have a lot of relevance to monitoring things like sustainable development and sustainability more broadly. And these are things like these more demographic and health surveys, censuses like the South African census that was released a couple of years ago. And here in South Africa, we've got a number of very clever PhD students who are exploring these data sets with their more social ecological approach to data collection and exploring how one can actually start tracking trends across space and time in those. And this is something that Micah Humman and Odi Selemani will be talking about more in our after lunch session. Just a little plug for that one on the SDGs. The second area where I think we're seeing some exciting traction of social ecological thinking is in this tools and methods. And Wency showed a picture of a toolbox. Sometimes I think it's more a tool shed. And the more I read, the more I realize it's more like a warehouse of tools, like Builder's Warehouse for those of you familiar with South Africa. So many methods and tools out there. Tools for understanding, tools for deciding, tools for managing and saving the earth, and a really large tool set for learning, which is really the one that I'm going to be focusing on, because I think in some ways that starts to blur these boundaries between understanding, deciding, managing, and it really becomes more about learning about the social ecological systems that you're studying or that you're managing or that you're living in. And one of the biggest tool sets is the models tool set, which is a very complex and diverse space. I'm pretty sure when I said the word model, everyone here thought about something different. Some of you thought of this guy. Again, it took me a while not to find a semi-naked, half-starved woman on Google for this one. I tried to go gender neutral for you, Bob, on this. But this modeling space is a very diverse and exciting space. And luckily, Gary summarized it. Oh, that's interesting. Here's hoping I can remember what those boxes used to say. Gary summarized the four categories of models. This is a real test for me. Is Gary in the audience? So Gary designed this really, he talked about these categories: tactical models, learning models, dialogue models, and design or decision models. Oh, thank you. Luckily, I was more wine tasting than wine drinking last night. In any case, I think that's a very useful way to think about this massive diverse space of models. I mean, they really do stretch from the very simple mental model across all the way to some very complex Bayesian types of models that people may be using. But I think an important thing to note is that in the social ecological space, models are seldom used as standalone. They're often more embedded in large processes like a resilience assessment, which is the one on the left, or in a large kind of decision-making support process like the INVEST model is used by the Natural Capital Project. And although you see many stages there of different models, they're not there just as a standalone output in themselves. They're actually there as a learning and decision-making and dialogue tool. I thought my time was up. Okay, and this is really what we tried to explore in 3 different use cases in the Eden District in the Southern Cape of South Africa, which has been the topic in several presentations yesterday and the day before, where the insurance industry, the brewery industry, and many stakeholders, multiple diverse groups in the wilderness catchment were interested in kind of exploring more social ecological systems change, disturbance, turbulence, and risk, and what could be done about it in this interesting part of the world. And I'm not going to go into the details of them, but really what we did across all of those projects was to use a loosely adapted resilience assessment approach with different kinds of models at different steps to help in learning about the social ecological system of interest, in looking at future scenarios and what this meant for the region, and even in coming to designing responses and implementing those responses with decision makers. Models were a useful tool in that. And so this is just a picture of the kind of diversity of models. Some were spatial, some were highly participatory, some were data-based, some weren't, some were diagrammatic, and some were conceptual. But very powerful tools when embedded in this kind of learning process we used in these projects. And in actual fact, what was interesting to me and many of us involved in them was that the findings of the models were never really talked about. You know, the numbers and the uncertainty ranges and all the things we often obsess about as scientists because you need to publish it. It was more about the higher level learning that had happened from these models. The fact that people began to understand just how connected their system was, how things that were happening in headwaters or in other parts of the country were relevant to things happening at a very local scale. And so and it was also a very powerful learning tool for us, I think, learning how decision making happens across scales, how budgets are allocated across scales, how sectors in one province impact on sectors in another local place. So they were very powerful tools from that. And in some ways we came distilling out the three powerful messages that we'd got across these projects was, that the systems understanding was really made very practical. So it was very clear to many of the decision makers in the public-private sector that the world is actually much bigger than you think it is. You're not just insuring a house on the beach. You really are very connected to everything else going on in the landscape. But they also, because they could bring in empirical evidence and were very helpful learning tools, and often we were using models and tools out of the actual decision-making or private sector partners, they offered a very empowering message of it's not all about climate change. You know, it's not throw your hands up in the air, there's nothing you can do. There are things that you can do at a landscape or national level over which you have power. And the final message, which was quite a novel message in many ways for these sorts of things, was that you actually can't do anything about this particular problem or challenge by yourself. It does require collaborative partnerships and learning and implementation. And we saw some very exciting responses, some new investments, some shifting institutions and policies, and also this very exciting development of these learning networks, which have continued beyond our involvement in several of these projects of multiple sectors and partners getting together to bring together the resources and the knowledge and the capacity to try and think about what to do next in many of these areas. So the third thing I wanted to very briefly explore is the broader process that's been adopted in more of these social ecological types of projects and programs. And Deborah reminded me that I too used to be a biologist. Fascinated by rodents, I didn't grind them up, I just stalked them across the grasslands of South Africa. But I think many of us got involved in, especially natural sciences, with the imagination that this was quite a solitary endeavor, that you would go out to the field and commune with nature, that you would then go back to the lab and play with your test tubes or play with your very large workstation. And you know, just do this all by yourself and maybe speak to your supervisor a couple of times, but that really was it. And the truth is, although there's a lot of this going on, as we discovered in the water policy and management space that Jean Nell led and that Nadia and Jean will be talking about more this afternoon, another plug for our session, is that really, although there's a deeply technical and scientific process that does go on in all of these projects, that's very data rich, that's often very empirical, it has to be paired with a very deep and collaborative social process of participatory data collation, modeling, mapping, engagement, exploring of results, and actually you're never alone in any of these spaces. There is no more solitary science, I think, in these kinds of projects. It's a deeply collaborative space. And this has really brought us to this idea of knowledge co-production, of co-design, and even collaborative implementation between scientists and stakeholders. And this is a figure that Nadia will be talking about a bit more, so I won't go into detail, but just really how systems thinking can be embedded in a truly collaborative process of science, society, and other stakeholders. And again, these projects have some very exciting results in the policy and management space, but also have had amazing impacts in the outreach and media and journalism space too, because of this deeply social process that involved several scientists hiking over several mountains with journalists to show them about the water challenges in South Africa. So I think in reflection, in terms of a social ecological systems lens and the three sort of major dimensions of that lens, you know, we're making some good progress in the practice area in terms of the inseparability of the social and ecological in our data sets and in our models, and how you can capture all those elements and their interactions. We're also really starting to help be able to think about scale and the impacts of scale on decision making and decision making on other scales. The one where we're struggling a lot is the concept of change. I mean, some of this learning is helping people become a bit more comfortable with change. And this is Wensi and others' book with these principles for building resilience, which really focus on how you can build capacity to deal with unexpected change. And several of them, I think, we're bringing into these processes. The learning focus, the complex adaptive systems thinking, the broad participation is certainly helping. But here I have plagiarized and then manipulated and probably destroyed Steve's slide. He assures me that plagiarism is the sincerest form of flattery. And so I think, when I think a little bit about the space and the work we're doing with decision makers and policy, and even with other scientists, and how comfortable people are with the known knowns and the static, predictable world, and becoming increasingly comfortable with the known unknowns of climate change and those sorts of scenarios. And as Steve said, these tools of scenarios and modeling really helping us penetrate and understand some of the questions we need to be asking about the known knowns and, to some extent, the unknown unknowns. But then we get to the space of these unknowable unknowns, which is really what social ecological systems thinking is about, the unexpected, the turbulent, the gradual, and the surprise. And, you know, not only do we lack some of the tools to be able to make that clear and help people become comfortable with that, including ourselves, when you think about the people you're working with, the skills that they have, and even the systems at their disposal for making decisions, and that's in the public and private sector, those systems are very structured around dealing with static known knowns and maybe some unknowns. They're engineering models, they're lines on maps, and this really makes it very hard to, even if people become comfortable with the idea of uncertainty and unexpected change, they go back into these systems that just aren't able to use it. So this remains a real challenge for us. I think the learning has certainly been a very helpful component of helping individuals that we work with become more comfortable and understand this. But beyond that, what about the places where they go back to work and the systems within which they work? And so I see this area, this sort of the change and turbulence and surprise, and also the gradual change, as really an area where we need to turn our attention to in coming up with some practical and useful tools that allow this to not only penetrate people's perceptions, but also really affect change on the ground. And so I'm going to end off here by thanking the many people who've been involved in this, including these crazy people here, and several of you in the audience as well who've been part of these projects and part of this thinking. Thanks very much.